Hi, History 115. Welcome back. This is week 14, lecture number 1. It's on China in the late 20th century. So today we're going to be talking about China in the 1980s and the 1990s, post-Mao era of rapid modernization and rapid changes in politics. So let me put the terms up on the board here. Here we are. So starting with the four modernizations. So we left off last time with Deng Xiaoping and his program of modernization. Let me expand my little window here a little bit. There, you can see me better. So we left off last time with Deng Xiaoping taking over after Mao. Sort of the new verdict on Mao. They keep him on the money. They keep him on Tiananmen Square. His portrait is there. His body is in Tiananmen Square for people to go and view. But even though the party holds on to Mao as its figurehead, it begins rapidly undermining the kind of policies that he supported. And as I said before, the official verdict on him was that he was 70% right and 30% wrong. And that 70% that was right was the revolution and building the party. And there would be no People's Republic of China without Mao. And the party judged going forward, even though there were many party members who were furious at Mao and wanted to put him behind them. The party felt that without Mao, there was nothing to hold the party together or legitimize its rule over China. So they held on to him, but the whole country changed. So again, with these four modernizations, these were the centerpieces of Deng's economic plan, modernizing agriculture through applying science, applying fertilizer, applying new techniques, industrialization. The second category, industry, heavy industry in China. The third being science and technology, funneling money into universities, building science programs. And finally, national defense, modernizing the army. The goal of this, starting in the late 70s, was to turn China into a world leader by the year 2000. And looking around you, you can see that this has succeeded. China is a world leader now in the 2000s. We're not quite there yet in our lectures. So in the 1980s and 90s, this seemed like a moonshot. China was coming from far, far, far behind the other industrial nations of the world. It was still an agrarian country. Its economy was still devastated from the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. But what it achieved in the 1980s and 90s was, from an economic standpoint, pretty much nearly miraculous. Through the 1980s and 90s, China had a growth rate of 9% per year in its economy, which no other country in the world had ever managed. So it was the fastest growing country in the world year after year, decade after decade, bringing it from this backward, agrarian, poor nation and launching it ultimately to the forefront of the industrialized nations of the world. It's an absolutely amazing accomplishment, lifting millions of peasants out of poverty. I should add as a side note here, so remember back in the Great Leap Forward, one of the slogans was to catch up to Britain in 15 years in the production of steel, which was absurd at the time, to think that China could make as much steel as Britain could. There was a recent Economist report, just to give you a new perspective from these days. So a few years ago, there was a report in the Economist magazine that China had just produced more steel in 2 years than Britain had for the entire period of time since the year 1900. So think about that. Not only did they surpass Britain, they went way, way, way beyond Britain's production of steel. So again, the four modernizations, the goal of turning China into a world leader in industry and its economy, and it has succeeded. There were bumps along the way, and we're going to be talking about some of those today. So in terms of the political philosophy of the 1980s and 90s, the catchphrase is socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is how the Chinese Communist Party talked about this, from the outside, very strange program of reform they had, because on the one hand, they are a communist party and their goal is communism in China. On the other hand, they were initiating all kinds of market reforms and free enterprise and things that look to anybody like capitalism. I'll come back to why that made, how they justify that. But this is what socialism with Chinese characteristics is. It is, well, actually, I mean, one way to think about it, it's a lot like the Tiyong of the 1860s. In the post-Taiping era, those early reform movements under Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang, where they wanted to keep Chinese as the essence, Western for use, trying to preserve the Confucian ideology of China while bringing in ships and guns and things like that. The 1980s was in some ways similar. The party held tight control to ideology in China, held tight control to education in the schools. Students were taught to work for the people. They were taught to emulate Lei Feng. You remember him from a couple of weeks ago. The public was exhorted to follow the party's version of history. But at the same time, they started bringing in Western technology and computers and things like that. Students began learning Western subjects. There were market reforms, new kinds of markets, new kinds of businesses opening that didn't seem to belong under socialism. And ultimately, an opening up to the outside world. But again, the socialism with Chinese characteristics, what it has in common with that Tiyong era, the post-Taiping era of conservative reform, was that on the one hand, China had to open up to the outside world. It had to welcome foreign advisors and foreign teachers. It had to open up foreign trade. But at the same time, it was hoping that it could keep out foreign ideologies, ideas about democracy, freedom of speech, things like that. So the opening up begins in a group of sites known as the Special Economic Zones, or SEZs. I didn't put that on as a term. I probably should have. But these were little pockets in China. Here, I'll put up the map. How about, see, new share. Let's put up the map of China. The special economic zones initially were, so right next to Macau, there was one. Right next to Hong Kong was the big one, Shenzhen. Right next to Guangzhou was Shantou, and then over here in Xiamen. One important thing to note is that Hong Kong, Canton, Xiamen, these were original treaty ports in foreign colonies. Zhuhai, which was across from Macau, Macau was a Portuguese territory at this point. As further special economic zones were opened through the 1980s, a lot of them would follow the same sites where the treaty ports used to be after the Opium War. And this is not coincidental. For the very same reason that those places were very conducive to foreign trade during the Qing dynasty, they're very conducive to foreign trade during the People's Republic. And especially Hong Kong, which was still a British colony and was heavily, heavily developed in comparison to China. That's why Shenzhen, which was just across the border from Hong Kong, exploded as the special economic zone because it had access to international trade through Hong Kong. So you have this interesting correlation between opening up special economic zones on China's terms, but they are located geographically in similar areas to the treaty ports that had been opened by force in the 19th century by the Opium Wars. But in any case, those were the places to get foreign technology, to build foreign joint enterprises, but again, trying still to avoid bringing in too much foreign cultural influence. So this has been the compromise since Deng. The party, it's still the Communist Party of China, and its goal is still someday to have China be a fully communist country. But the compromise has been to open up free markets and barely constrained capitalism, while at the same time keeping a very tight control over ideology and a monopoly on power. There is still only one party in China that rules. It's the Communist Party, and it controls ideology and the newspapers and the internet, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as to why this makes sense for a Communist Party to be leading capitalist reforms, I wanted to explain that also. And the argument in favor of that, and really the underpinning logic of all of this, goes back to the early 1980s, and it was with a theory of the initial stage of socialism. What is the initial stage of socialism? It was an argument put forward by certain party leaders that Karl Marx's vision of communism or the Soviet Union's vision of communism, these were based on countries that were beginning already with a highly developed capitalist economy. They already had big raging industries. They already had full-on capitalism. And so everything about Marxism, everything about Russian socialism was founded on a capitalist country, a highly developed capitalist country, turning into a socialist and ultimately a communist country. And so the argument that was made in China and which stuck starting in the early 1980s was that China was different because it was not a developed capitalist country. It was an agrarian country. It was a farming country. And therefore, as the argument went, in order for China to get to the real stages of socialism and communism, they tried to launch into them in the 1950s and 60s, and it hadn't worked. They concluded that first they had to develop capitalism. So the unleashing of capitalism in China by the Communist Party was rationalized as being the initial stage in what would ultimately lead to China becoming a communist country fully. So you start by building it as a capitalist country. Side note, as the argument went in the 1980s, this might take 100 years. But after 100 years, once it was a fully developed capitalist country, then they could move on into socialism, and then the dream of communism would be realized down the road. So that is the best explanation I know of for how this makes sense, to have a communist party leading capitalist reform. It's just one step along the way to the ultimate goal. Anyhow, so in the 1980s and 90s, we have rapid development of the economy, rapid modernization, and westernization. It's impossible to avoid it, which has several long-term effects. For one thing, there's a creation of wealth, enormous amounts of wealth. But looking at the map here, primarily concentrated along the coast in the special economic zones and in the cities that are opened up to foreign trade. Initially, that wealth does not penetrate into the countryside. So along with the development of wealth comes an unevenness of wealth. Deng Xiaoping said to get rich is glorious, but some people have to get rich before other people do. So by the time you get to the 1980s, and especially in the 1990s, you have the creation of classes once again, that there are rich people and there are poor people. Whereas the whole Mao era had been trying to collapse all of those and put everybody at the same level. So while you have great opportunities for people who can make money in the 80s and 90s, people who feel left behind become quite bitter about that. As things improve, as material quality of life improves, as electricity comes to remote villages, as they get televisions and things like that, they can see just how much richer than they are people in Shanghai are, or people in Shenzhen near Hong Kong, or people in Canton. And this, again, it creates resentment. And even in the 90s, I remember talking to people in the countryside who would talk about how their lives had improved and they had more to eat than they did a generation earlier. They had electricity, they might have a television for the whole village to come and watch. But as they said, as several of them said to me, at least in the Cultural Revolution, everyone was equally poor. So think about that, that these were people whose lives were clearly better off than they had been in the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward. But the resentment that they felt about how much better it was for people in the big cities along the coast gave them a certain amount of nostalgia for a time when at least we were all equal. And we weren't the poor people. Everyone was on the same plane. So you have a growing divide between rich and poor, between the coast and the hinterland, and a crisis of ideology for Chinese as they begin learning more about what's happening outside of China's borders. This was also a big shift in the Deng era. During the Mao years, people in China, all they knew about what was going on outside of China was what the government let them know, what they read in government-controlled newspapers, and reports that they heard on government radio. So with the free enterprise of the 80s and 90s, there are new television stations, there are movies coming in, there are TV shows coming in from abroad. It's still being controlled in a lot of ways, but especially if you live near if you live near Hong Kong, you can pick up Hong Kong stations, and they're completely free there. So in the 80s, as news began to trickle back into China about what the rest of the world was like, there was a real shock of how far behind China was and how poor China was in comparison to the rest of the world. You can compare this shock to the feeling of the Chinese students who went abroad to study in Japan in the early 20th century. Remember, after the exam system ended in 1905, there was a whole flood of Qing Dynasty students going and studying in Japan and seeing China from the outside for the first time, and for the first time seeing how weak it was and how threatened it was in the era of imperialism. That was when the foreign press was calling China the sick man of Asia. Well, in the 1980s, nobody was calling China the sick man anymore. However, people who lived in China who were proud of advances in their lives since Mao, and this is the early part of the economic reforms. In the 1980s, it was a really big deal if an urban family could buy a refrigerator or a bicycle. There were various objects like that today we take for granted, but which for families in the mid-1980s were really something to aspire for and save up for, and then finally have as a prized possession, a television, something like that. And then when they turn on the television, they see programs from abroad, where they see programs from America where people have multiple televisions in the house, and they have several cars in the garage, and they're running around with their guns and doing whatever they do in American movies. But it was a shock of how poor China was compared to these Western nations where people just seem to be dripping money. And again, you don't get the most accurate view of things by looking at movies or TV shows, but still, this is what they largely had to go on. So there was no longer any danger of imperialism to China after Mao. But still, there was this sense of a once great empire that has now fallen behind the rest of the world. And then there were other problems inside the country. So you have a rising economy, and you have some people getting rich, other people getting left behind. You also have a really dramatic rise in corruption. This is very, very important. As the party relinquishes certain controls on the economy, corrupt officials take advantage of this to start funneling money into their own pockets, to start cutting personal deals to enrich themselves and their friends. And in particular, the children of party leaders were seen as largely untouchable in the 1980s. These were the princelings, like Deng Xiaoping's family members, Zhao Ziyang's family members, various party leaders' kids were making ridiculous amounts of money because they had party connections, and if they engaged in private enterprise, they could ignore the laws, they could do whatever they wanted in order to make money. Similarly, local officials started demanding bribes of various kinds. People wanted to get rich, and the way for officials to do it was the same way they did in the Qing Dynasty, which is to force farmers to pay them extra fees, to force people to pay extra taxes. And a resentment of this was also brewing in the 1980s, of the corruption of party members and especially of their children, a sense that ordinary people were just getting left behind. While rich people and those who had connections were taking off in their economic prospects, people who were connected to a high-ranking member of the party had advantages. But for the ordinary, everyday person in China, even though the economy was moving forward, there was a certain sense of desolation, that they're being left behind. This is not my miracle, and this is what's going to lead to the descent of the late 1980s that we're building towards here. So in terms of dissent, in terms of disagreement with the government, in terms of sort of popular protest, our starting point here is 1978 with the Democracy Wall movement. This was in late 1978 into 1979. It was a wall in Beijing that people started putting big character posters up on. You remember these big character posters from the Cultural Revolution. This is not much later. This is 1978, right after Mao died. People are still very familiar with this medium. The posters going up initially were criticizing the Gang of Four. This is when they were under trial and being blamed for the Cultural Revolution. But on this wall, these anonymous posters that were being put up began leaning towards criticism of the government. And in particular, the most famous poster to go up on the democracy wall was by a man named Wei Jingsheng. That's Weijingsheng. He's a term for today. And his poster was called The Fifth Modernization. And as he argued, the fifth modernization, after agriculture, industry, science and tech, national defense, the fifth modernization was democracy. In saying that what the government owed to the people of China was to modernize politics by bringing in democracy and allowing them to vote for their leaders. For putting up that poster, he got himself sentenced to 15 years in prison. And he's an interesting case, Wei Jingsheng is, because he posed a different kind of a threat to the party than they had expected. The party expected intellectual dissent. They expected students to be critical, and professors and writers and newspaper editors, people like that. People who were highly educated and lived in a world of ideas, they're always criticizing things. That's what they do. This is what they are. Wei Jingsheng was a worker, though. He was very much from the working class, not an intellectual. I met him a long time ago. He swears like a sailor. He's this foul-mouthed chain smoker, like salt of the earth kind of guy. And as a worker, he's what the party is supposed to represent above all. Intellectuals are always suspect, but workers are supposed to be firmly in the camp of the government. And for a worker to be calling for democracy and challenging Deng Xiaoping to give it to the people of China, this was threatening. So he got himself locked up, 15 years of prison. Goodbye for now to Wei Jingsheng. So that was sort of a precursor to what's coming. So again, it's 1978, 1979, the Democracy Wall movement. Further intimation of things to come. In 1986, there were student demonstrations in 15 cities in China. About 100,000 students marched around. They were demanding freedom of speech, freedom of the press, free elections. And as they marched around in Beijing and other cities, they were recreating the experience of the students of the May 4th era. Remember back in 1919, when Chinese students sort of discovered this international pageantry of marching around and carrying signs and chanting slogans. Back then, they were calling for abrogating the Treaty of Versailles, and they were criticizing the government. And these students in 1986 were very much in the same mold. They were critical of the government. This time they wanted democracy. They wanted free speech. They wanted freedom of the press. Again, they wanted elections. And they had a sympathizer in the government, importantly. He's on the terms list this week, Hu Yaobang, Huyaobang. Hu Yaobang, he was the youngest veteran of the Long March. Remember the Long March from 1934 when the communists left their base and went on that year-long trek to their new base at Yan'an. Again, the core of the party leaders, the core of the party mythos. Hu Yaobang was the youngest veteran of that. He was a protege of Deng Xiaoping, and in 1986, he was general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. Deng had sort of pulled into the background a bit, but so Hu Yaobang was one of the most important party members, and he was in favor of letting the students march around and shout their slogans. And he argued within the party, said, let them vent. We can use this energy. We can channel it towards the reforms. This is something that can be good. Within the party, however, there were hardliners who were adamantly opposed to this kind of protest. They blamed Western liberalism and various Western influences. And so there was a tension within the party. Hold on to this. There's a tension between reformers in the party who are supportive of these kinds of protests. They look at what's happened in Eastern Europe and they see that positive changes can come from this. And then you have hardliners who want to maintain tight party control and do not want to allow any kind of dissent. In 1986, it all ends peacefully. Exam time came, the students went back to school, they stopped marching around and protesting, but Hu Yaobang was purged by the hardliners in 1987 and lost his position. So he's the one to hold on to here. Hu Yaobang, supportive of the students in 1986, gets punished for it in 1987 by getting removed as general secretary of the Communist Party. So that round of demonstrations ended peacefully. You know, the students marched, then they went back to classes, and life went on. However, in the year following, China ran into some very serious economic problems. 1988 and into 1989, the government began implementing price reforms. This was shifting from a controlled, planned economy where all of the prices are set by the party and the government, to market reforms where you can start letting prices fluctuate based on supply and demand. This was seen by the party as a necessary step towards capitalism and towards ultimately enriching the country. But the immediate effects of it in 1988 were a 30% inflation rate. Think of that. So 30% rise in the price of basic goods, which was threatening to continue on into the next year. How did people react? Well, they reacted pretty much the way people here react when they announced the pandemic: panic buying. People bought all of the goods they could get their hands on because, in this case, with very, very high rate of inflation, they realized that their money was becoming worthless. And that if they didn't buy, literally, that people were buying all of the stores of toilet paper in Beijing in 1988. That if they didn't buy all their toilet paper, it was going to cost twice as much, in a year or two. They were buying food. They were buying beds. There was an interview with one woman who was in line to buy a bed, and this was in Beijing, and she told this reporter, "Well, I don't need a bed. I already have a bed. But everyone's buying them, and I don't know if there's going to be one if I need one in a couple of years, so I'm going to buy it, and I'm going to try to fit it into my apartment." So this was really terrifying for the public. So rise of prices, panic buying of goods leading to shortages of basic goods, and what comes out of all of this economic mess is a lot of anger towards the government. And further anger about corruption in the people who were getting rich or the people who had access to goods that they no longer had. And so it was largely because of this debacle of the price reforms in 1988 that a lot of the discontent of students at universities spreads much more widely in society. Whereas in 1986, it was just college students marching around and calling for democracy, sort of idealistic students. By 1988 and going into 1989, you had a lot of anger at all levels of society, in all different professions, in all different classes, that everyone was frustrated about the economy, and they were frustrated with how the CCP was leading China in this new era. Which brings us to 1989. 1989 was a year of anniversaries, and anniversaries are very, very important in China. So as far as these anniversaries, 1989, it was the 10th anniversary of the Democracy Wall movement, which ended in 1979. It was the 40th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. It was the 70th anniversary of the May 4th movement in 1919. And it was the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution in 1789. So these 9 years were a big deal, and there was a big convergence in 1989, which helped to create a sense that this was a year for change, and this was a year for unleashing the power of the people, like the French Revolution, or the founding of the PRC, or the May 4th movement. So how did things begin in 1989? The spark in 1989 for what would turn into the protests was that on April 26th, Hu Yaobang, who you will remember from the Democracy Wall movement, he was the general secretary of the CCP who was in favor of the protesters. On April 26th, he died in 1989. And students began turning out to mourn for him. And this was socially acceptable. Actually, and you know, this had been done when Zhou Enlai died earlier. But it was an occasion for people to come together publicly, and by mourning one figure, they could criticize another. So what began as mourning for Hu Yaobang turned into complaining about the government and complaining about the people in government who had removed him in 1987. So in April of 1989, students in Beijing began staging a sit-in in Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square, this is the most iconic site in China. The big red gate with the portrait of Chairman Mao on it, you will see this in all, like, as a background of news reports. When China had the Summer Olympics, they all ran under the portrait of Mao for the marathon. And you know, this is in the huge plaza in front of it, Tiananmen Square. This is where the huge Red Guard demonstrations were in the Cultural Revolution, and millions of people marching around. Right at the gate of the Forbidden City, where the emperors used to live, this deeply symbolic site. And these protests began to grow. And the students they had slogans like "Long live democracy," "Down with corruption." And as they grew in these protests, it drew in not just students anymore. Workers came to join them, writers, intellectuals, journalists, even some officials, people from various different backgrounds, grown-ups and students alike, all coming together, until ultimately you have just a massive demonstration. Let me shift over to an image of it here. Here you go. Here's a view across Tiananmen Square. This is Tiananmen. Tiananmen means the gate of heavenly peace. So this is the gate of heavenly peace. Here's the portrait of Mao, and here is the ocean of protesters in 1989. By the middle of May, there were about 1 million people taking part in the demonstrations in Beijing, coming and going, some of them camping out there. You can see various tent cities that have been set up, carrying signs and slogans, various groups from different work units or from newspapers or from different universities coming together. And along with 1 million people in Beijing, there were smaller protests in 23 other cities around China. Very importantly, this was not just a student movement anymore. It had become a much broader social movement. Students were the core, they were the leaders, but the people who were coming to take part, the majority of them were not students. They were coming from all sorts of different backgrounds, just ordinary townspeople coming through and standing around, hearing what the students had to say. And there are real questions to this day of how you can take a group of people this big and say what it wants. What did the protesters want? Well, it depends who you talk to. And a lot of reporters went interviewing people around on Tiananmen Square. And among the things they found were, well, the students in general were calling for democracy. They wanted political change in particular. But if you press them on what they mean by democracy, you would get a lot of different answers. And so, you'd be interviewing a student and say, well, what do you want? We want democracy. And then the reporter would ask them, so do you mean one person, one vote? And they would say, no, not that. The peasants, they don't know enough to be able to vote, but educated people should all get a vote. So they had various ideas of sort of an elite democracy where smart, highly educated people like them would get to pick the government. Talking to other people, for a lot of the workers, what they wanted most was an end to corruption. Or they wanted prices to go back to normal. They wanted the government to rein in all these crazy reforms that had gone haywire. They wanted the government to stop letting high-ranking party members' children get rich at the expense of other people. As the picture grows, the biggest thing that comes out of this is a desire for political reform, for rational political reform, and for the party to reform itself and to put an end to corruption. Democracy was really more of a fringe issue in this. And as it's going to be understood abroad in Europe and the United States, I'll come back to this, but it comes to be known strictly as a democracy movement or as a revolutionary movement trying to overthrow the government. This isn't really true. There were many people calling for democracy, but there were just as many people calling for an end to corruption. They were not revolutionaries. They weren't calling for an end to, well, some were revolutionaries calling for an end to the party. Most of them wanted the party simply to go back to being more honest, and to be more careful with the reforms that it was engaging in. But these questions really linger. There were questions, was this pro-Western? Was this sort of a democracy movement in a Western model? Were they trying to be like America? Or was this really a deeply patriotic Chinese movement? And in terms of this course, you can think of this along with episodes like the 100 Days reforms in 1989. I'm sorry, 1898. You transpose a few numbers there. The 100 Days reforms in 1898. Or the Donglin Society at the end of the Ming, remonstrating with the government, trying to get it to reform itself before the country collapses. Neither of those came to a good end, and these protests in 1989 would not come to a good end either. In terms of the United States, and this is important, this is something that's sort of personal to me, because all of this was happening when I was a senior in high school. And I knew nothing about China at all then. And then suddenly, all day on TV were these images from Tiananmen Square. And this is Tiananmen is a watershed in U.S.-China relations. I told you about the Nixon visit and how overnight there was this sudden feeling that, oh, the Chinese are just like us in America and we're all friends. Still, people didn't know much about China. These protests in 1989, one of the key factors here was that CNN was there. CNN, which you now know as a website, cable news network. Cable news network was a brand new thing back in 1989. They had just gotten started. And at the time, nobody thought there was any point to having a 24-hour cable news station. Most people just got their news and watched TV for half an hour on ABC or CBS or something in the evening. Why would you want to have 24 hours a day of news footage? And along comes Tiananmen, and you had people in the CNN reporters there with video cameras filming this, beaming it back to American living rooms, and Americans were glued to the television watching this. And these incredible oceans of protesters. And just these wonderful happy images too. Here, I love this one so much. This was a news photographer who took it. Just happy young Chinese people. Here they are, like practicing their ballroom dancing, which is a Western style of dancing. And to Americans watching from their living rooms, and who were weaned on this post-Nixon idea that the Chinese are just like us, but maybe their government won't let them be. You have a general sense in America that, the Chinese people are finally demanding a life like Americans have. They want a democracy, they want freedom, they want a ballroom dance, they want more prosperity, etc. So Americans saw this largely in terms of America. Americans tend to do that. So as they understood the protests in Tiananmen in 1989, they understood them as democracy protests, pro-America, trying to become more like the United States. Let me put the big picture back up on here again. Part of this was due to the fact of, see this statue here? This was the goddess of democracy. And it looks a little bit like the Statue of Liberty. It happened to be in somebody's art studio during these protests, and so they pulled it out on Tiananmen Square. It sort of represents the French Revolution, and it was called the Goddess of Democracy. But a lot of the images that were beamed to the United States, or the photographs in the newspapers, focused in really, really closely on this. And Americans could see, they have a Statue of Liberty. That means they want to be like America. Similarly, as the cameras panned across these huge, huge crowds on Tiananmen Square, a lot of the signs, most obviously of the signs that were being held were in Chinese, and most Americans couldn't read those, so they didn't know what they meant. But occasionally the cameras would pan onto a sign calling for democracy in English. Why was it in English? Well, the students who were studying English and who were studying American history or French history or British history, whatever, those were the people who were most likely to be interested in democracy as a political concept. And they were the most likely to be able to write it in English. But the effect of this is that the American viewer looking at all of these signs, and the only ones they understand are the ones in English, those ones happen to be about democracy. So again, it feeds into the sense that the entire thing was trying to topple the Communist Party and return a multi-party democracy to power in China. That doesn't catch the full picture here. But in any case, the government began to feel more and more threatened by the continuance of these protests. Once again, you have factions within the party of those, some of the leaders go out to talk to the students, who say we need to channel this energy and use it to strengthen the party and to push the reforms, while you have hardliners who think that this is going to lead to chaos, this is going to lead to a new cultural revolution, and ultimately they get their way. So on May 20th, martial law was declared. Everyone was ordered to leave Tiananmen Square, but they didn't. Why didn't they? Part of it was underestimating the will of the government to make these protests go away. Part of it was individual student leaders. There's a documentary that you can watch if you have the time. I think it's on YouTube these days, but it's called The Gate of Heavenly Peace. And it's a documentary about the Tiananmen protests in 1989. And there's an absolutely chilling interview in there with a young woman named Chai Ling, who was one of the student leaders. And it's an interview in a hotel room with a foreign reporter. This is after the declaration of martial law. She was one of the student leaders calling on the students to stay in place, don't leave, stay where you are. And as she tells this foreign reporter, she says, there will never be any change without bloodshed. We have to shed our blood, and only then can there be a real change in our country. This was not what she was telling all of those students who she was shouting at through a megaphone. She was saying, we have to stay principled. But the idea that a student leader like that could essentially know that many of these people who are following her are going to be killed, and like leading them into the slaughter is just unconscionable. And she, like many of the student leaders, managed to get out of the country as soon as the protests went south. As soon as the government cracked down, they already had contacts to get away to safety, while the students who suffered were the ones who stayed behind. In any case, they did not leave, and then finally on June 4th, 1989, the army was sent in, the tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square, and you get iconic images like this one, which is one of the most famous news photographs in the history of news photography. This is Tank Man. The man sort of just plaintively standing in front of this row of tanks. The tanks were actually leaving Tiananmen. This is the next day. But the symbolism of that, just this worldwide attachment to this photograph as the symbol of like one single individual standing in the way of the mechanized military power of the state, and the courage of this. If you look at the actual video, the tanks are trying their hardest not to run him over. They're trying to get around him, and he'll get in front of them and whatnot. Interpret that however you want. But in any case, the army moved in, and there was a bloody end to the protests in 1989. Nobody knows how many people were killed in Tiananmen Square. The government officially says nobody was killed in Tiananmen Square. Technically, many of them were killed outside of the square in the side streets. But people who were there in Beijing at the time testify that hundreds, if not thousands, of people were killed, rushed to hospitals. There were violent clashes between protesters and soldiers. Soldiers were killed. They were set on fire. A horrible, bloody, fiery night to end this period of what had been very hopeful protests, hoping for some kind of positive change. As I said, most of the student leaders fled into exile. Some became professional dissidents. You can think of somebody like Sun Yat-sen, living abroad, not allowed to go to China because he's a dissident, raising money abroad, going around giving speeches. This is what a lot of those student leaders did after 1989. Others of them went abroad and became bankers and business people and became rich. And one of them, Wu Kai-shi, who's a Uyghur, who was this like wiry, good-looking guy, became really fat because he got rich. And then nothing. This was the remarkable thing about 1989. That it was, U.S. shut down trade with China. The authorities in Beijing were referred to as the butchers of Beijing. There's this worldwide backlash against China for this violent crackdown against the demonstrators, but it went away. The U.S. ultimately restored most favored nation status to China for trade. Protests like this did not happen again. And taking a wider view, looking into the 1990s, the sad irony of this is that the crackdown was immensely successful. It was terrible and it was tragic, but from a Machiavellian government standpoint, it worked. There were no follow-up protests. There was no attempt to overthrow the government. And what you have after 1989 in China is a dramatic reduction in political dissent, at least vocal dissent, and political activism. And in the mid-90s is when I started going to China. I first lived in China from 1993 to 1995. And as an American just out of college, going over to China, what I expected is that everyone I talked to would tell me how much they hate their government and how they can't wait for it to be overthrown so they can finally have the democracy they've always wanted, because this is how Americans were taught to think. And interestingly, most of the people that I talked to, even ones who had taken part in the protests in Changsha, where I had been, mostly what they said was politics is a dead end. In 1989 proved that. And there is nothing that we can gain from marching around in the streets again. Meanwhile, there are new opportunities, and it's much better. And I heard this over and over from various people to say it's better to focus on your career, take care of your family, try to find ways of making a little more money, improve your life. Don't meddle in politics, because look where it all leads. There was a total news moratorium on this. My students at the middle school where I taught in the mid-90s had never heard of this. It was just something that had never occurred to them. And again, it's still something that's very much under the surface. In that post-1989 period, Deng Xiaoping withdrew behind the scenes, and the government rolled on. I'm going to give you a couple other changes from the 90s. I'll go a little bit overtime today. You can turn me off if you want to, but we're getting towards the end of the semester. And there are so many things I want to tell you about. Other defining features of the 80s and 90s, the one-child policy. In the Great Leap Forward, Mao had encouraged Chinese people to have as many kids as possible, because why should China fear the atomic bomb if we can just make more people? Leaving China in the 1980s with a huge population explosion, overpopulation in China, 1.2, now there's 1.4 billion people in China. How can you feed them? So in the 1980s, they implemented a one-child policy of, in theory at least, limiting all Han Chinese families to having one child. Let's look at what this means. There were varying levels of coercion to get people to go along, from rewards for having only one child to various punishments to having two. But ideally, if you have a society where couples only have one child, think of what that means in the long term. It means that nobody would have, after a generation, nobody has a brother or sister. All of the kids going to school are only children. After a generation, nobody has any uncles or aunts because their parents are all only children. They have no cousins. Think of the family line shrinking down like that. And to the extent that the one-child policy worked, this was the experience. Very few people had siblings. And then eventually very few people had cousins. The social result of this was the spoiling to death of only children in many cases, especially wealthy urban families. And social critics in China called these people little emperors or little dumplings. And the stereotype was sort of this plump little boy who was just doted on by his parents and his grandparents who only had one grandchild, and the whole family just spoiled him rotten, and he marched around telling them what to do and was badly behaved. that these little emperors became a symbol of China's new prosperity, bossy children, telling their parents what to do. Through the one-child policy, there was still a preference for sons. This is the old Confucian belief. In Confucian days, it was because the son was the one who stayed in the family while the daughter left to join the other family. And the son was the one who performed rituals for you after you died. In 1980s and 1990s China, that wasn't an issue anymore, but still there was a strong preference for boys. And so many baby girls were abandoned to adoption. There was a rise in female infanticide. And even with all of this, China added 125 million people to its population in the 1990s, which is an entire Japan, if you want to think about it in those terms. So the population was still rising, but not at the same rate. But now, today, in where we live now, this policy has ended now, effectively. And couples are allowed to have 2 kids if they want to. Urban families can have 2 kids, but what the government in China has found is that for the most part, most couples don't want 2 children anymore. They are accustomed to a culture, to a society where people have 1 child. And hardworking urban parents don't necessarily want 2 kids to take care of and deal with their schooling and childcare and all the expenses that go with them. So they're now confronting a problem of not having enough kids being born. And as we look forward, one of the biggest problems that China faces going forward through the next few decades is an aging population. That huge baby boom from the Mao years is getting older and older and older. And from the one-child years, the population of young people of childbearing age now is much smaller than it would have been naturally. So you have a population that's skewing towards the elderly. By the year 2050, China is estimated that it's going to have 329 million people over the age of 65. It's 329 million people over the age of 65. Furthermore, the reduction in the younger population means that the military age population of young men in China by 2050 is predicted to be about half what it is now. Same for workers in factories. So you're going to have a smaller and smaller number of working age people having to support a larger and larger, proportionally, a larger and larger group of elderly people. That is going to be a real problem. At the same time, you have a loosening of restrictions in society, all kinds of new kinds of freedoms in the 1980s and 90s, especially in the 90s. It used to be that Chinese people under socialism had a danwei, that's D-A-N-W-E-I. That's your work unit. If you work at a factory, you live at the factory provides your food and your health care, and you retire in your factory. If you work at a school, that's your work unit, your danwei. You teach at the school, you live at the school, you eat at the school, you're paid by the school, your health care is provided by the school. So the work unit really was the central point of your life. Wherever you happen to work, that is your work unit. If you were in construction and you were building buildings, first you build the first couple floors and then you live in them while you build the rest of the building. If you work in a subway, you live in the subway. If you work in a park, you live in the park. But because your work unit was responsible for giving you salary, food, pension, things like that, this was called the iron rice bowl. That you may not be making very much money, the healthcare might not be great, but you had it. And you knew that you would be provided for. And this was sort of the basic social contract of socialism in China, this iron rice bowl. By the 90s, the government was breaking down the danwei system. There were still many danweis, still many work units, but they existed side by side with these foreign joint ventures and private enterprise companies that worked entirely differently. They didn't have the same requirements to take care of their employees for their entire lives, but they might pay more. And they give you more freedom in terms of changing jobs. So this era in the 90s, this is referred to as the breaking of the iron rice bowl, when people gained new freedoms and opportunities, but also lost a lot of guarantees that they had had under the old system. So they had maybe new opportunities in their job or where they lived. Just between the mid-1990s and the early 2000s, people in China gained the right to buy houses and apartments for the first time in socialist China. Instead of being given whatever housing their work unit gave them, they could buy an apartment. They could move to other cities, which they couldn't do previously. Workers from the countryside could migrate to the big cities of the coast and become this huge labor force. In the 90s, there were estimated to be 100 to 130 million floating workers. For the most part, they would camp out outside of train stations, just oceans of them in the 90s. Whenever you came out of the train station in Guangzhou or in Shanghai, again, all you could see were workers in blue Mao jackets camped out, holding up little signs saying what they can do. They can do masonry, they can do electrical work, and all around skyscrapers are going up, and the contractors who are building them just go to the train station and you bring them all on. But this movement of society creates its own sense of fear and disorder. People were afraid of all of these young men camped out outside the train stations. There were worries about if the economy goes downhill and all of these 100+ million migrant laborers don't have jobs, what are they going to do? Is there going to be a rise in crime? What's going to happen because of this? So the 90s, it was an era of prosperity coupled with uncertainty. That you could get ahead, but there were new threats in your life, versus nostalgically looking back at the 50s and 60s, people started thinking, well, there were the problems of the Great Leap Forward, but the party was more honest then, or we were all poor, but everyone was poor and there was no sense of inequality. So by the 90s, you start getting nostalgia for even the really horrifying periods of the 60s and of the 50s and 60s, especially for people that did not directly suffer in the Cultural Revolution, people who managed to sort of squeak through or even have their status improve in some way. So I'm going to give you one more thing here, because again, it really typifies the 90s. And it's gone quiet for now. It's going to come back sooner or later. And it's the Asian values debate, the so-called Asian values. This was a big debate in the 1990s, a big international debate about freedom versus order. And as the lines in the debate generally broke down, it was a debate between sort of Western democracy on the one side of like democracy and free speech and freedom of action, et cetera, versus on the other side, stability and order, which were said to be Confucian and were said to be inherently Asian. A system which gave the importance to the group over the individual. Individuals were supposed to subordinate themselves to the good of the group. This matches fairly well with the sort of Confucian government in traditional China. It doesn't mean that people in China were not selfish. The government had to keep them from being selfish. But in any case, during the 1990s, a lot of people in China, when they were quizzed by various traveling Americans coming through the country about, well, don't you want more freedom after 1989? What a lot of people would say is they point to the Soviet Union and what happened there. They point to Russia and they say, look at Russia. Now they have political freedom. The Communist Party is no longer in charge. They can vote for who they want to be in power, but there is nothing in the stores. They have a miserable economy. They say, and now look at China. We don't get to vote for our leaders, but the department store, there's a new department store being built every other week down on some street corner. The stores are full of food and electronic goods of every kind. Isn't that better? Wouldn't you rather have that? In some ways, it's a false choice. In some ways, it's a real choice. For China, the possibility that going over to democracy and freedom, et cetera, with a country that big might lead to some kind of a collapse or might lead to product shortages. In any case, the center of this debate in the 90s was not China itself, but Singapore, which I'll put up here on the board. And again, those of you, I've gone past the hours. Those of you who want to turn me off, go right ahead. And to give you one more thing. Singapore, which I'll put up here. So here's China. And all the way down here is Singapore, which is a city-state of about 2 million people down at the tip of the Malaysian peninsula. which is Chinese, ethnically Chinese. They speak Chinese there. And the Asian values debate in the 1990s really centered on Singapore and its prime minister, Lee Kuan Yew. That's Leekuanyew. He was really the big one advancing this notion of Asian values. He said the Westerners have their ideas of individual freedom. We have our Confucian ideas of order and stability leading to prosperity. And Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew was really set itself as the model of that. It was incredibly clean. It had the most modern subway system in the world at a time when you would, I mean, still you go down to the New York subway and it smells like urine and there's rats running everywhere. In Singapore, you could eat off the ground in the subway. There were these glass walls along the platform and the subway would come in noiselessly and then these glass walls would open and let you on. The trade-off for that was, I should have dredged it up for this lecture, but I loved a photo I once saw, a sign I once saw in the Singapore subway saying, you are currently being watched by about 40 CCTV cameras. So the price for this was social control. There were cameras everywhere watching you to make sure you weren't breaking the rules. And there were a lot of rules in Singapore. No spitting, no chewing gum. Gum was illegal. If you've ever had a durian fruit, D-U-R-I-A-N, they're really good, but they smell horrible. It's this huge fruit. It's really stinky. People describe it as like eating the sweetest strawberries while sitting in an outhouse. So it smells horrible. But you know, you're going down the steps or you're going down the escalator into the Singapore subway, and there's a big picture of a durian fruit with the red line through it saying no durians allowed. So it was a very tightly controlled society, but very orderly, very prosperous, very, very clean. And this debate came to its peak in 1994 during the Clinton administration, when an American teenager named Michael Fay did what American teenagers do and went on a vandalism rampage and vandalized several cars in Singapore. He was living there as an expat. He was arrested, he was put on trial, and he was sentenced to being caned 6 times. This was one of the punishments they had in Singapore, which is resonant of the old Qing dynasty code of laws. You know, different crimes prescribe different numbers of being smacked with different sizes of sticks. In any case, this was perfectly normal Singapore justice, but Americans were horrified. The idea that he was going to be beaten as some kind of punishment. This was totally out of line with America's sense of how people should be punished. And this was really the pinnacle of the Asian values debate, because on the one hand, you had Americans who were horrified, saying he didn't hurt anybody. All he did was harm some cars. He harmed property. Why is he being beaten? On the nightly news, there would be little segments about, with doctors saying, oh, well, if you're hit with a rattan cane, it can cut you open and get infected and terrible things can happen. Bill Clinton was on the phone begging Lee Kuan Yew not to go through with this. And they went through with it and they gave him this beating. And as all the Americans were there saying this is horrible and barbaric, people in China and other Chinese societies were saying, well, Singapore is only doing what this kid's parents probably should have done a long time ago, which is get him in line. The aftermath of that, so Singapore asserted its right to assert its own laws in its own way. As Lee Kuan Yew talked about it, this is about Asian values, that order and society are the important thing. And this individual freedom, some kid going off and breaking things, that is not allowable. That simply cannot be tolerated the way that Americans tend to indulge it or even encourage it. I looked up Michael Fay a little while ago just to see what happened, and the caning didn't even work. So this isn't even really like a good enactment of Confucian justice. He was arrested a few years later for drug trafficking. So yeah, whatever, he was incorrigible. In any case, I will leave you with 1997. At the end of the 1990s, looking forward to the new millennium, which is our final lecture next time. 1997 was an important year for prognosticators, and they got it all wrong. It was a very important year for China. In 1997, Deng Xiaoping died on February 19th. This marked the end of the era of the Long March veterans. And there was the question of who can possibly replace them in the leadership of the Communist Party. And the outside China watchers all had been predicting that as soon as Deng Xiaoping finally died, the party would fracture, China would transform, it would fall apart. This did not happen. The party held on to power. Also in 1997, Wei Jingsheng was released from prison. This is Wei Jingsheng of the Fifth Modernization back in 1979. All of the outside watchers had been predicting that if Wei Jingsheng gets released from prison, then we know the government is going to reverse the verdict on 1989 and allow that it made a terrible mistake in 1989 and honor the dead protesters as martyrs to democracy. That did not happen either. There was no change on that front. And then finally, also in 1997, on July 1st, Hong Kong was finally returned to China, which had been a colony of Great Britain ever since the Opium War, ever since 1842. In 1997, it had a society and a political system that was completely different from China's. It had been a colonial administration under Britain. At the very last minute, when the British knew they were going to give it back to China, they implemented democracy really quickly as sort of a poison pill for China. But in any case, when Hong Kong returned to China, all of the China watchers in other countries had been predicting that as soon as Hong Kong is returned to China, the tanks are going to roll in and crush Hong Kong's civil society. That did not happen either. But if you follow the news, you will know that it took 20 years, but huge tensions have now arisen in Hong Kong between young Hong Kongers' sense of what their local government should be and what Beijing thinks it should be. So that's created enormous problems now, 20 years later. But in the 1990s, it seemed peaceful and people were out on the streets welcoming the PLA when they came into Hong Kong. So that will do us for the 1980s and 90s. And when we come back on Wednesday, we have the pragmatic politics of the new millennium, the 2000s, the consciousness of an upward trajectory of China moving upwards, resuming its place as a central power in the world, with the party at the center of that under Xi Jinping. Thanks for bearing with me, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.